In this video, we'll once again visit our To-Dos app and implement tests using Jest and Enzyme. In doing so, we'll work with the mount method along with the find, props, simulate, update, and HTML helper functions from Enzyme. Let's begin. Enzyme is a testing utility for React by the Airbnb open source team and is somewhat like the React testing library. It provides the ability to manipulate and traverse the tree of DOM nodes to assert tests using a high-level API. Enzyme works with a lot of test runners including Jest, which makes it quite easy to work with. The API offered by Enzyme is a bit like jQuery's API for DOM traversal and manipulation. To begin with, Enzyme provides three kinds of renderers. The shallow renderer can be used for testing components in isolation because it will only render components one level deep, which is sometimes sufficient because unit testing generally involves a single isolated component. Shallow rendering is useful because it doesn't let the component affect the behavior of any child components, resulting in pure isolation of the component in testing. While the shallow renderer supports state manipulation in class components, it currently doesn't support the useState hook when working with function components. The second rendering technique, known as full rendering, is made available using the mount function. In this case, the component and its complete child component tree is rendered using JS DOM, which simulates a real headless browser, offering the full power of DOM APIs. Your component is rendered into the DOM. This is what we'll use in our example. The third and final technique, known as static rendering, simply renders a static markup of your component, giving you access to the HTML along with parsing and traversing APIs from Cheerio, a popular solution for traversing HTML programmatically. So let's get back to our project app one last time and use Enzyme. Unlike React testing library and Jest, Enzyme needs to be installed and configured. So first up, I'll install Enzyme and Enzyme Adapter React 16 as development dependencies. The Enzyme Adapter React 16 package is required to get Enzyme to work with React 16.x. Next, at the root in the src folder, we need a file named setuptests.js. This file is now usually present as a part of the Create React App toolchain. If not, you can simply create it here like so. The purpose of this file is to configure your test environment and frameworks. In our case, we'll import the configure method from Enzyme along with the adapter from the Enzyme Adapter package, and we'll pass a new instance of this adapter to the configure function like so. This enables Enzyme to understand and work with React 16.x features. Next, I'll create my tests folder and we'll straight away write our test for the add to do component. I'll import React and the component to test, and we'll import the mount function from Enzyme. The mount function will perform a full render of the component into a headless DOM, giving you complete access to DOM APIs. While unit testing can be done using the shallow renderer as well, it currently doesn't support the useState hook properly, among other things. Since useState is in use in this particular component, we'll have to resort to the mount function instead. In my test block, I'll again set up a mocked function to test the prop, and as convention goes, we'll name our constant wrapper, into which we'll render the add to do component using mount like so. Once again, we need to find the input field and simulate the change event, where we'll simulate typing something in followed by pressing the enter key. So I'll say wrapper.find, and we'll have to use DOM selectors here to find our element. I'll use the node type as input. We'll then chain a simulate function where we want to simulate the change event, setting the value of this field as this is an amazing task. To simulate pressing the enter key, I'll chain another simulate with the key up event where the key is set to enter with key code 13. Now, to check a given prop using Enzyme, in our expect function we can type wrapper.props.onAdd. Wrapper.props is a function that gives you access to all props on the root node, which in this case is the add to do component itself. Wrapper.find.props lets you select an element and work with its props. We'll see that in a bit. For now, all we are saying here is that the onAddProp should have been called with this object, and you can see our test passes. Now, we also want to check if the event simulation above empties our input field or not. This time we can use the wrapper.find to select the input field followed by props.value. And this test passes as well. This is how Enzyme is used. Let's build our test for the status button now. Once again, we'll get React, the mount method, and the component itself. We'll build two sets of tests, one where the status prop is set to false and the button is clicked and vice versa. For the first test, I'll mount the component, setting the status prop to false, and the onDone prop to a mocked function, which we can later examine. It is important to note that to investigate a function prop, it must be set to a mocked function first. Then we can just use wrapper.find to find the only div in the component which renders the button and will simulate a click. Then we can expect the onDone prop to have been called with true. And it passes. We can then use wrapper.find on the div to get the class name property because we want to test the class name as well. This test also passes. I'll then quickly flip the test for the second case. And this passes too. Enzyme is quite easy to work with and gives you plenty of options. Our last test involves snapshot testing the app itself. So first up, we'll bring in React, mount, and the app. And I'll also copy down the mocked API services from the last video. We'll then set up our describe group. Now here, our app needs to query an API, which means we are using the use effect hook, which then updates the state. When this happens, you need to use the act method from the React DOM test utils. This was not the case with the React testing library, but that was only because the render function from React testing library internally uses act, so you don't have to. In the case of Enzyme, we'll have to use the act method to perform async functions for which we need to wait. So our test function needs to be async first to begin with. Next, I'll instantiate a variable named wrapper and we'll use the act method to wrap the invocation of mount like so. This enables Enzyme to perform side effects and resolve promises correctly. This then allows us to use wrapper.html to fetch the rendered output and use this to get a snapshot. This works beautifully. Next, let's try adding a task. I'll again use wrapper.find to grab the input element and use the simulate method to add a task like so. Now logically or mentally in this case, we should proceed to another snapshot. But we get this error instead. The reason for this is that our simulated events cause our app to interact with the mocked API before an update to the state is made. This is an async function which will not get registered by itself since we are not using act here. So what we can do to manually resolve this problem is to use the act wrapper to run wrapper.update, a function which syncs the Enzyme version of the DOM tree with what the React component tree should be if an external side effect is involved. Now, since a second snapshot was taken, it is now obsolete, so press U on the keyboard to update the snapshot. This is a standard Jest feature. This now works and our updated snapshot does show up the added task. Enzyme is pretty good for testing React components, and you can read more about the API on their official website. To summarize, you have a ton of test runners and frameworks for writing tests. My personal favorite is the React testing library for Jest because it's simple, effective, comes installed, and greatly mimics a user's point of view when writing maintainable tests. But whether you use Enzyme, React testing library, or any other testing solution, the fact that test driven development is key to writing error free and maintainable code is reason enough to start writing tests today if you haven't been doing so already. Happy testing!